What are you doing at my father's grave? The voice cut through the silence of the cemetery like a blade, laden with indignation and authority. Brandon Whitmore, 28, slammed on the brakes of his Porsche when he saw three figures kneeling before the Italian marble mausoleum that marked the resting place of his late father. Keisha Washington, 32, slowly raised her face, revealing eyes red from crying. Beside her, three identical 8-year-old boys, Tyler, Mason, and Dylan, clung to her legs, frightened by the aggressive interruption of their moment of mourning. I asked what you're doing here, Brandon repeated, approaching with firm steps, his designer suit contrasting sharply with the family's simple clothes. This is a private cemetery. You shouldn't be here. Keisha stood up slowly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. There was something about her posture, an unshakable dignity even in the face of hostility, that should have alerted Brandon that this was not just another ordinary intruder. We have every right to be here, she replied in a firm but controlled voice. Your children have come to say goodbye to their father. Brandon let out a bitter laugh. Their father? Ma'am, my father was Richard Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Industries. What would someone like you have to do with him? What Brandon didn't know was that Keisha had worked as Richard's personal assistant for 5 years. She knew every dirty secret of the company, every questionable deal, every document her father had desperately tried to keep hidden. More importantly, she knew exactly why Richard had changed his will a week before he died. Look here, Brandon continued, pulling out his cell phone. I'm calling security if you don't leave immediately. This is private property, and you're trespassing. Tyler, the boldest of the triplets, stepped forward. Mr. Richard always said we were his special boys. He played with us every day at the office. Brandon's expression changed instantly. For the first time, he really looked at the boys' faces. The same piercing green eyes as Richard, the same distinctive Whitmore family chin, the same dimple on the left side of their faces that he himself carried. That's impossible, Brandon muttered, his aggressive tone giving way to growing uncertainty. My father would never. Keisha opened her worn purse and pulled out a yellowed envelope. He left this for you. He said that when the time was right, you would understand why he kept us a secret all these years. Brandon took the envelope with trembling hands, immediately recognizing his father's elegant handwriting. As he read, his face grew progressively paler, the seconds turning into an eternity of awkward silence. The letter revealed not only that Richard had secretly recognized the triplets as his children, but also that he had left them 40% of his estate, a fortune of approximately $60 million. Even more shocking, Richard admitted that Brandon had never been his biological son, but only his adopted heir, raised to maintain social appearances. This has to be a hoax, Brandon stammered, crumpling the letter. A pathetic attempt at blackmail. Do you think you'll get money from my family with this ridiculous story? But even as he spoke, Brandon couldn't stop looking at the boys. The resemblance was undeniable, disturbing, impossible to ignore. And Keisha stood there with the unshakable calm of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. If this story of family, secrets, and inheritance has touched your heart, get ready to discover how a simple assistant turned a young millionaire's world of privilege into his worst discovery, and why the truth is sometimes the most powerful revenge there is. Brandon grabbed his phone furiously and dialed quickly. Michael? It's Brandon Whitmore. I need you to come to Riverside Cemetery immediately. We have a situation that requires urgent legal intervention. His voice carried all the arrogance of someone accustomed to solving problems with money and connections. Keisha watched the scene with disconcerting calm, as if she had expected exactly that reaction. While Brandon paced nervously, talking on the phone about intruders and attempted extortion, she knelt again among the triplets, whispering reassuring words. "Mommy, why is that man angry?" asked Dylan, the most sensitive of the three, clinging to Keisha's arm. "Sometimes people get angry when they discover truths they would rather not know, sweetheart," she replied softly, but her eyes remained fixed on Brandon. But the truth always finds a way to come out. 20 minutes later, a black Mercedes pulled up next to the mausoleum. Michael Harrison, the Whitmore family's lawyer for 15 years, got out of the car looking extremely annoyed at being disturbed on a Saturday afternoon. At 52, he had built his reputation defending wealthy families in delicate situations like this. "Brandon, what's going on here?" Michael asked, adjusting his glasses as he assessed the scene. "This woman showed up out of nowhere with these boys, claiming they're my father's children." Brandon gestured aggressively toward Keisha. She has a forged letter and is trying some kind of elaborate scam. I want you to sue her for defamation, extortion, trespassing, anything that can land her in jail." Michael approached Keisha with the condescending air of someone who had dealt with opportunists before. "Ma'am, I am the Whitmore family's attorney. I understand that the death of an important person can attract malicious individuals, but I can assure you that any attempt at fraud will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." Keisha slowly stood up, reaching for her purse and pulling out a binder. "Mr. Harrison, I believe you should see this before making any accusations." Her voice maintained that irritating serenity that was making Brandon increasingly nervous. She opened the folder, revealing not only Richard's original letter, but dozens of other documents. There were photos of the baby triplets with Richard, medical records of paternity tests performed years ago, emails exchanged between them discussing the boy's future, and even copies of monthly bank transfers Richard had made to a savings account in the triplets' names. Michael examined the documents with growing discomfort, especially when he found his own signature authenticating some of them. His expression changed dramatically, from condescension to confusion, then to something that looked like contained panic. This is impossible," Michael muttered, recognizing documents he himself had prepared in absolute secrecy years ago. Richard never mentioned much," Keisha interrupted, her voice taking on a firmness that made both Brandon and Michael instinctively recoil. "As his personal assistant for 5 years, I had access to all his files, all his private meetings, all his special arrangements." Brandon snatched the documents from Michael's hands. "These are elaborate forgeries. My father would never have children with a, he stopped himself, but the damage was done. The word he almost uttered hung in the air like a toxic cloud. "With a what, Brandon?" Keisha's voice was dangerously low now. "Finish the sentence. Let's hear who you really are behind that polite man's facade." The triplets hid behind their mother, feeling the tension mounting. Tyler, always protective, held his brother's hands as he watched the confrontation with eyes that seemed decades older than his 8 years. "Listen here," Brandon exploded, completely losing his composure. "I don't know what kind of scam you're pulling, but my father built an empire. He would never associate with people like you. This is an insult to his memory and an offense to our family." Michael tried to calm him down, but Brandon was out of control now. "You know what? I'm going to make this public. I'm going to expose this sham in every newspaper, show everyone the kind of people who try to take advantage of grieving families. When I'm done with you, you won't even have a place to live." That's when something changed in Keisha's face. What had been patience and dignity turned into something much more dangerous: cold, calculated determination. She picked up her phone and began typing rapidly. "What are you doing?" Brandon demanded. "Sending an email," she replied calmly. "To the board of directors at Whitmore Industries, to the major shareholders, to some very competent investigative journalists, and, oh yes, to the Internal Revenue Service." The blood drained from Michael's face. "Wait, let's talk calmly." "Calm down." Keisha laughed, but there was no humor in that sound. "I've had 5 years of calm, Mr. Harrison. 5 years of organizing Richard's files, 5 years of knowing exactly where every dirty penny went, 5 years of keeping quiet about transactions that would make the FBI salivate." Brandon took a faltering step backward. "What are you talking about?" Keisha put away her phone and smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Do you really think I worked as the personal assistant to the richest man in town for 5 years, just organizing his schedule? Do you think a black woman, a single mother, could keep a job like that just by being competent?" The implication hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Michael and Brandon exchanged nervous glances, finally beginning to understand that they had seriously underestimated the woman in front of them. "Richard hired me because I was a forensic accountant before I had the boys," Keisha continued, her voice taking on an almost pedagogical tone. "He needed someone who understood numbers, who could reorganize certain inconsistencies in his accounting books. Someone discreet. Someone no one would suspect." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing through the trees in the cemetery. "Now," Keisha said, checking her phone again, "you have exactly 2 choices. First, you legally recognize my children as legitimate heirs, execute the will as Richard wished, and we all go on with our lives in peace." "And the second option?" Michael asked, his voice almost a whisper. Keisha's smile widened but remained icy. The second option is for me to reveal exactly why Richard changed his will a week before he died. I can tell you about the evidence he uncovered, about certain people who thought they could manipulate a dying man, about forged documents and forged signatures that made Brandon look like the natural heir when, in fact... You're bluffing, Brandon interrupted, but his voice was shaky. Am I? Keisha tilted her head. How interesting that you're so sure of that, Brandon. Almost as if you know exactly what forged documents I'm talking about. Do you really think I spent 5 years as Richard's personal assistant just setting up meetings? Keisha laughed, a sound that made Michael instinctively recoil. Let me clarify a few things for you. Brandon was red with anger, the veins in his neck bulging. I don't know what kind of blackmail you're trying to pull, but my father would never. Your father, Keisha interrupted, emphasizing the word with sarcasm, discovered 6 months ago that someone was embezzling money from the company. Millions of dollars funneled through ghost contracts and shell companies. Imagine his surprise when he found out who was behind it. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Michael had gone completely pale, while Brandon alternated between confusion and growing fury. Keisha pulled out her phone and showed them an audio recording. Richard asked me to document everything discreetly. He had his suspicions, but he needed proof. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly where to look. She pressed play. Richard Whitmore's unmistakable voice echoed in the quiet air of the cemetery. Keisha, if anything happens to me before I can expose this publicly, I want you to have all the evidence. Brandon can't know I found out. Not yet. Brandon took a staggering step backward. This is fake. Digital manipulation. Is it? Keisha smiled coldly. How interesting that you're so sure of that. Almost as if you know exactly why Richard would be concerned about evidence tampering. It was at that moment that a black car approached. Detective James Rodriguez from the police department's Financial Crimes Unit stepped out of the vehicle along with 2 federal agents. At 45, Rodriguez had an impeccable reputation for not being intimidated by money or influence. Ms. Washington, he greeted Keisha respectfully. We received your email with the preliminary evidence. Very impressive documentation work. Michael tried to intervene. Detective, there's been a misunderstanding. The Whitmore family has always cooperated fully with any investigation. Mr. Harrison, Rodriguez interrupted him, I advise you to remain silent. Especially considering that your signature appears on several of the documents we are investigating. Brandon exploded. You can't just show up here and believe the accusations of a licensed forensic accountant who worked directly with the victim for 5 years. Rodriguez finished. Mr. Whitmore, I suggest you contact your attorney. A different one, he added, looking meaningfully at Michael. Keisha watched with growing satisfaction. 4 months, ever since Richard had discovered the fraud, she had meticulously documented every suspicious transaction, every revealing conversation, every altered document. Richard had trusted her not only because she was competent, but because he knew she had personal reasons for wanting to protect his children's future. Detective Rodriguez, Keisha said calmly, the evidence I sent you is only a sample. Richard hid the original files in 3 different locations. All the passwords and locations are in the will he left with me. What will? Brandon shouted. The only valid will is with our lawyers. Keisha pulled another envelope from her purse. You mean the forged will that was discovered 2 days after Richard's death? The one that conveniently omits any mention of the triplets and leaves everything to his adopted son. Michael's expression changed to one of utter terror. Brandon looked as if he had been struck by lightning. Adopted? What are you talking about? Oh, Brandon, Keisha shook her head with feigned sympathy. Richard discovered that you weren't just a thief. You're not even a blood Whitmore. He had a DNA test done after he began to suspect fraud. The results explain a lot. Rodriguez signaled to the federal agents, who began to approach Michael and Brandon. Gentlemen, you are suspects in a corporate fraud and legal document forgery scheme. You have the right to remain silent. Wait. Brandon shouted, finally realizing the gravity of the situation. This is a misunderstanding. I can explain everything. Keisha knelt down again between her sons, who had watched everything with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Tyler, always the most observant, whispered, Mommy, will they stop being mean to us now? Yes, sweetheart, she replied, hugging all three boys. Sometimes the truth takes a while to come out, but when it does, it fixes a lot of things. As Michael and Brandon were handcuffed, the latter shouted desperate accusations about conspiracies and setups. But his words sounded hollow in the face of the mountain of evidence Keisha had patiently compiled. Rodriguez approached her. Mrs. Washington, we're going to need your formal statement. And those passwords you mentioned. Of course, detective, Keisha smiled, taking a flash drive from her purse. Richard was very meticulous. Every penny stolen is documented here, with dates, times, and even recordings of the meetings where Brandon discussed how to hide the money. As the police cars drove away with Michael and Brandon, Keisha remained in the cemetery with her children. She placed her hand on Richard's gravestone, whispering, "We did it, Richard. Your boys will have the future you wanted for them." What Brandon and Michael didn't know was that Keisha had spent the last 6 months not only gathering evidence, but also establishing connections with federal prosecutors, investigators specializing in white-collar crime, and even investigative journalists interested in the story. But there was one last surprise waiting, one that even Richard hadn't anticipated when he decided to trust Keisha with his darkest secrets, because sometimes true justice comes from unexpected places, and the sweetest revenge is the kind that turns victims into victors in ways no one could ever imagine. 3 hours later, at the federal police station, Brandon sat in a sterile interrogation room, his handcuffs clanking against the metal table every time he tried to gesture. On the other side of the one-way mirror, Keisha watched as Detective Rodriguez presented stack after stack of evidence she had meticulously compiled. "Mr. Whitmore," Rodriguez opened a thick folder, "we have here bank records showing transfers of $2.3 million from the Whitmore Industries corporate account to a shell company called Millennium Consulting. A company that, interestingly, has only one registered employee, you." Brandon tried to maintain his composure, but beads of sweat were beginning to form on his forehead. "This is a misunderstanding. Millennium Consulting is a legitimate consulting firm that we hired to." "For what, exactly?" Rodriguez interrupted him, sliding another document across the table. "Because according to the records Ms. Washington provided us, Millennium Consulting never produced a single report, never had a real physical address, and was created exactly 3 days after Richard Whitmore was diagnosed with terminal cancer." Brandon's expression changed from defensive arrogance to something close to panic. For the first time, he was beginning to understand the extent of what Keisha had uncovered and documented. "There's more," Rodriguez continued, turning on a tape recorder. "Your secretary, Jennifer Mills, has decided to cooperate fully with our investigation. Apparently, she saved copies of all the emails you asked her to delete." Jennifer's voice echoed through the room. "Brandon told me to delete all records of communication with Millennium Consulting. He said it was to simplify the books after his father died. When I asked if this was legal, he told me I wasn't paid to ask questions." Brandon clenched his fists, the veins in his neck bulging. Jennifer is a disgruntled employee. She was being fired for incompetence. "Interesting," Rodriguez smiled coldly. "Because she also recorded several conversations with you. Would you like to hear the one from March 15th, where you discuss how to forge your dying father's signature to legitimize your fraudulent transfers?" Meanwhile, in an adjacent room, Michael Harrison was having his own interrogation session with FBI agent Sarah Chun. The stack of documents in front of him was even bigger than Brandon's. "Mr. Harrison," Agent Chun said calmly, "in 23 years as a lawyer, how many wills have you forged?" "I've never forged a will," Michael replied, but his voice was shaky. Chin opened a folder and took out the official will that left everything to Brandon. Next to it, she placed another document, Richard's real will, written in his own hand and authenticated by a different notary. "This is Richard Whitmore's real will," she explained. "Written a week before his death, leaving 40% of his estate to his 3 biological children, the triplets. The will you presented to the court? Different paper quality, different ink, and a signature that doesn't match any of Richard's other signatures from the last 6 months." Michael tried to take the document, but his hands were shaking so badly that he dropped it. "That's impossible. I personally prepared Richard's will." "You prepared one will," Chen corrected. "The fake one. Richard prepared the real one with another lawyer, Joseph Martinez, from Martinez and Associates. A lawyer who, incidentally, recorded Richard explaining exactly why he was changing his will and creating a secret version." Chen turned on another tape recorder. Richard's weak but determined voice filled the room. "Joseph, I need you to understand. I've discovered that Michael Harrison and my adopted son Brandon are systematically stealing from the company. They don't know I know, but I have all the evidence. This is my last attempt to protect my real children and ensure that justice is done after my death." Michael slumped in his chair, finally realizing there was no escape. Richard knew. He knew everything. "Oh, he knew much more than you realized," Chen smiled. "For example, he discovered that Brandon was not only stealing money, but also forging documents to hide his own origins. Did you know that Brandon isn't Richard's biological son? That he was illegally adopted through a scheme you yourself organized 28 years ago?" On the other side of the mirrored glass, Keisha was watching everything with Tyler, Mason, and Dylan by her side. The boys had been looked after by her younger sister, Alicia, during the tense hours at the police station. "Mommy," Tyler asked, "will that mean man try to take our inheritance away from us anymore?" "No, sweetheart," Keisha smiled, hugging all three of them. "Sometimes it takes time, but the truth always comes out. Your father Richard left everything documented to protect you." Detective Rodriguez left the interrogation room and approached Keisha. "Ms. Washington, I must congratulate you. In my 20-year career, I've never seen such a meticulous compilation of evidence. How did you manage to document all this without them suspecting anything?" Keisha smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "Richard had been suspicious for months. He asked me to investigate discreetly because he knew that, as his assistant, I had access to all the documents. He was dying, Detective. He wanted to make sure his real children were protected." "What about the flash drive you mentioned?" Keisha pulled a small device out of her bag. Richard was extremely meticulous. He recorded more than 40 conversations with Brandon and Michael discussing how to hide the money. He installed monitoring software on all the company's computers. He knew he was dying and turned his last months into an intelligence operation. Rodriguez nodded in admiration. "How many years in prison do you think they'll get?" "Brandon? At least 15 years for corporate fraud, document forgery, money laundering, and even for his illegal adoption. Michael? As a lawyer, he'll get even more for violating professional ethics and conspiracy." At that moment, Jennifer Mills appeared in the hallway, looking nervous but determined. "Ms. Washington? I'm Jennifer, Brandon's former secretary. I wanted to thank you for giving me the courage to tell the truth. He threatened me so many times." "Jennifer, you were very brave," Keisha hugged her. "Richard always said you were a good person forced to do the wrong thing. He really talked about me. Constantly. He knew Brandon was coercing you. In fact," Keisha smiled, "Richard left specific instructions for you to receive financial compensation for being forced to participate in the scheme against your will." Jennifer began to cry. "I don't deserve anything. I was part of it all." "You were being threatened by a powerful and desperate man," Keisha consoled her. Richard understood that. He wanted to make sure the real victims were protected. 2 hours later, formal charges were filed. Brandon Whitmore was indicted on 12 federal counts, including large-scale corporate fraud, falsification of legal documents, money laundering, and conspiracy. Michael Harrison faced 15 charges, including will forgery, breach of professional ethics, and criminal conspiracy. But the final blow came when Agent Chun revealed to Keisha that the FBI had frozen all of Brandon and Michael's personal accounts and had launched an investigation into every legal case Michael had handled over the past 10 years. "Ms. Washington," Chin explained, "based on the evidence you provided, there is strong suspicion that this scheme has been going on for much longer than we thought. We are reviewing dozens of cases where families may have been defrauded by this duo." Keisha held her children tighter. "How many other families have they destroyed?" "We're investigating at least 20 suspicious cases. But thanks to your work, we finally have the tools to get justice for all of these victims." As they left the police station, Tyler looked up at his mother. "Mom, can we visit Dad Richard's grave whenever we want now?" "Always, my love. And now we can tell him that justice has been served." But there was one last surprise waiting for Keisha at home, a surprise that even Richard hadn't anticipated. Because sometimes true justice comes not only from proof and evidence, but from the way people choose to honor the memory of those they loved, and how a simple assistant can turn the greed of powerful men into the catalyst for their own total and irreversible destruction. 6 months after the trial, Keisha sat in the law firm she had opened, Washington and Associates, Justice for Families. The irony was not lost on her. She now occupied the same building where Richard had built his empire, but this time defending victims of corporate fraud. Tyler, Mason, and Dylan played in the corner of the room, their private school uniforms contrasting with the humility Keisha made a point of maintaining. The $60 million inheritance had been fully released by the court, but she had invested most of it in her children's education and her mission to help other families harmed by similar schemes. "Mom, more letters have arrived," Tyler announced, handing her a stack of mail. They were from families thanking her for the investigation that had exposed Michael Harrison's other frauds. 17 additional cases had been uncovered, resulting in millions of dollars in compensation for the victims. Detective Rodriguez appeared at the door with a satisfied expression. "Keisha, I have good news. Brandon received 18 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Michael got 22 years plus permanent loss of his law license." "What about the other families they defrauded?" Keisha asked. "All being compensated. The FBI estimates that you saved at least 50 families from losing their inheritances." At that moment, one last piece of mail arrived, a handwritten letter from Jennifer Mills, who now worked as a corporate ethics consultant. "Ms. Washington, you gave me the courage to stand up for what is right. Thank you for showing me that the truth always wins." Keisha looked out the window, seeing the city where she had fought so hard for justice. "Richard," she whispered, "your boys are safe. And we did much more than protect them, we created a legacy." At that very moment, Brandon sat in his federal cell, watching a report on Keisha's law firm's success on the prison television. His expression was one of utter defeat. He had lost not only his freedom, but any chance at redemption. The reporter concluded, "This story proves that true justice comes not from revenge, but from the courage of ordinary people who refuse to accept injustice." Keisha hugged her 3 children, reflecting on how a painful encounter at the cemetery had turned into the greatest victory of their lives. They had not only regained their inheritance, they had turned trauma into purpose, pain into power. The best revenge, she thought, is not to destroy your enemies. It is to build something so great that they realize how much they wasted by underestimating you. The lesson was clear: when powerful people abuse their position, sometimes justice needs a little help from those who have courage, intelligence, and above all, the determination to never give up on the truth. If this story of justice and overcoming adversity touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that the truth, however long it takes, always finds a way to prevail.